Muting myself. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight and to talk a little bit about my research. So, and thanks to the Alumni Association here with the University of Aberdeen for having me and for inviting me. I'm not an Aberdeen University alumna, but I've been kindly adopted by this wonderful institution 4 years ago when I joined here as a lecturer in history. And I'm teaching and I'm researching, and that means that I'm constantly in touch with wonderful students in history. And yes, so I'm part somehow of the alumni community here, because it's fantastic to see how, you know, how students are working with us, leaving us, but then coming back or staying in touch, either privately or to work with us. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight. So my talk will be about half an hour, and I will take you through a case study that has to do with my research interests at the time. So I just realized my internet is dropping. I will briefly restart it. Back in a sec. So I should come back on any minute now. Here we go, I'm back. Chloe, do you have a chance to share my slides? Thank you so much. Okay, here we are. So this is the title of my talk. My current research field is constitutional monarchy. So I'm working on several constitutional monarchies in Europe throughout the 19th century, which is a long 19th century, and I look at these monarchies as institutions. I'm currently writing a monograph on the specific role of succession and of heirs to the throne in constitutional monarchical settings. That means in political systems where the power of the monarchy is limited by some sort of constitutional arrangement. So why looking at the next generation to the throne is interesting? So of course there's a crucial biological function. You need an heir to the throne to keep the hereditary system of monarchy up and running. But beyond mere biology, I'm concerned with the question, what was actually the place of the royal heir in the social and the cultural, the political fabric of monarchical settings? So I'm particularly interested in heirs in the political sphere. So how and when is succession discussed in politics? When does succession become a topic of political decision-making and so on? And a few of my recent case studies have taken me into the realm of charity and philanthropy, because there's a clear political dimension of royal charity work. And many heirs to the throne are actually actively engaging in charity work. Here's direct contact, so to speak, an overlap between a political sphere of interest and a royal or monarchical sphere of interest, influence, and cultures. The history of charity, with a focus on the British monarchy, has been researched on particularly by Frank Prochaska, a historian, and he's done a lot of work on the modern welfare monarchy in Britain, and I'm building on his work. Because charitable work and patronage and philanthropy are, of course, very traditional features of monarchy. So my question is, do these very traditional features change in constitutional settings? Do they develop different dimensions of meaning or different cultures? Because, of course, 19th century nation states provided a very specific framework. We've got the rise of mass media, we've got a diversification of political participation through the establishment of party politics, we've got more ministerial responsibility. The monarch is head of state, but he's not, or she is not, being held responsible for political decision-making anymore. So this has been coined to be a loss of hard power on behalf of the monarch. But on the other hand, royal families reach out to their subjects, actively engage with them to accumulate what we call social capital, to create a connection and legitimacy from this kind of contact. And one of these means to reach out is patronage, is philanthropy. A broad argument has been made that royal heirs like to engage with philanthropy because it helped them stay clear of the political power play and of the domain of the monarch, so as not to interfere with the monarch. One could say they use charities and patronage to carve out a public profile for themselves. But my example today hopefully shows that royal charity work was in fact far from apolitical. It created great opportunity for royal family to engage with current themes and issues of the day, but it was not without any consequences. So when I went to the British Library a long time ago, I sat in the manuscripts collection and I came across a letter. And this letter piqued my interest, so I'm going to share it with you now. Here it is. On the 2nd of July, in 1907, the British Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, received a letter of heartfelt thanks on behalf of Prince George of Wales. "Dear Sir Henry," it said, in the words of Arthur Bigger, that was the private secretary of the Prince of Wales. "Needless to say, the Prince of Wales is delighted and relieved that the King's Hospital Fund Bill has passed through its final ordeal in the House of Commons, and His Royal Highness desires me to say how deeply grateful he is to you for having by your own personal actions safely piloted the bill through waters which threatened to be so stormy. His Royal Highness intends to thoroughly reorganize his council, and I do believe that he will eventually satisfy those who wish for more representation in the administration of the fund, choosing his own men." So this level piqued my interest on several levels, as you can imagine. Here's a direct correspondence between the Prince of Wales and the Prime Minister, which shows a connection between the royal sphere and the political sphere. What is more, it's a letter of gratitude. So you will have noticed the very emotional use of language here. You know, it says there's an ordeal is mentioned, great relief is mentioned. So clearly the matter that is discussed here was very important to the Prince of Wales, and he stressed a personal support provided by the Prime Minister in resolving it. So I thought I might learn something from this case about the connections between the monarchical and the political spheres using philanthropy. So let's talk a little bit about what is behind this letter. Let's start with a key term from this letter, the hospital fund. What is it? Go. The hospital fund was founded under the name of the Prince of Wales's Hospital Fund in 1897, and it was on personal initiative of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. Apologies for the typo on the slide. It was on personal initiative of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. You see him here on the right in the photograph, together with his son, Prince George. This is a photograph from about 1890. So Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, became King Edward VII in 1901. So in 1897, he published a letter, or a letter on his behalf was published in the London Times, inviting subscriptions in celebration of the 60th anniversary of the reign of Queen Victoria. The purpose of the hospital fund was to raise money for London's voluntary hospitals. At the time, the voluntary hospitals offered the only health services available to poor people in the capital. And the hospital fund not only wanted to raise money, they also wanted to ensure that contributions raised flowed towards those hospitals in greatest need, so they would make a decision where to send the money. The first distribution of grants by the fund took place in 1898, 1 year after the subscription. And in the first year, already donations amounted to £57,000. And the charity grew and grew very quickly. By 1905, the hospital fund distributed about £110,000. which became the richest source of revenue for London hospitals. And it had already accumulated capital along the lines of £1 million. So it really became a vast organization very quickly and a very successful organization. Upon becoming king in 1901, Albert Edward handed the presidency of the hospital fund over to his son and heir, Prince George. In 1902, the fund was renamed into King Edward's Hospital Fund for London, and in 1907, this is mentioned in the letter, and I will come back to this particular event, the fund was incorporated by an Act of Parliament. Today, this institution is known as the King's Fund, and His Royal Highness Prince Charles of Wales has been active president of the institution since 1986. So there's a long history involved. The hospital fund has been researched on. Early research on the hospital fund in the 1940s focused on the consolidation, the professionalization of this organization. But more recent work was interested in how support was actually rallied, so who gave to the fund and how were people motivated to give money to this. I'm particularly interested in the royal engagement with this charity and where it brushes with political cultures. So there's a very traditional role for a monarch or a prince to be involved in philanthropic work. But these developed new dimensions in the 19th century. Since the reign of George III, the British royal families had realized that philanthropy not only furthered the common good, but that in turn charities were useful for the monarchy as well. Philanthropy put members of royal families in touch with contemporary issues and with opinion, and charitable patronage reaffirmed the royal family's importance and created legitimacy. So it might not surprise us to see the Princess of Wales' involvement in the hospital fund. Both Edward and George cared deeply for the hospital fund. As presidents, they played a very active and personal role in its daily business, as well as in developing plans for the charity's future. Just to put this into perspective, Prince George served as a patron or president of over 400 societies in the day. That's a lot of societies. And yet it seems that he dedicated much of his dedication and attention to the hospital fund. He personally presided over meetings, he chaired committees, he wrote reports, you name it. So if this had happened today, he would probably spend a lot of his time in Zoom meetings or in Teams meetings. It's interesting to see, though, that the organizational structure of the hospital fund was completely tailored to the prince's persona. So it was completely tailored around the patronage of this one person. The Prince of Wales, as president, directed and managed the affairs and the property of the corporation, together with a general council. But the prince also appointed the members on the general council, as he saw fit, it says. The president constituted committees for the administration of the fund. He also appointed or delegated the committee members. The president appointed and removed treasurers and secretaries and office staff and made sure they were paid in a certain way. And the president had control to direct the distribution and the allocation of funds. One could say the hospital fund provided an institutional framework for these royal princes to exert pretty much unchecked authority and control over the charity's proceedings to an extent that was seen by contemporaries as being a bit out of touch with modern society. A quote from one parliamentary debate that said, where a member of parliament said, and I quote, "It would be seen that the president had full and complete power, unlimited, uncontrolled, and unchecked." So the question is, why does that matter to the contemporaries? At the turn of the century, we have multiple voices in British politics and society that addressed the valuable efforts of philanthropy. But these voices also identified problems within the public health sector, and they discussed the role of scientific medical research. They also discussed public representation in politics and society. That means that the Princes of Wales, when they were presidents of the Hospital Fund, they never acted in a vacuum. They were representatives of a monarchy responding to the challenges of 20th century societies. It was relevant for these modern dynasties to convincingly represent a welfare monarchy, a monarchy that is seen as caring for their subjects. So the Princes of Wales received great public attention for their absolutely admirable philanthropic work, but being visible as active philanthropists in the public sphere meant that they were also exposed to challenges, to criticism of all kinds. So the princes became a part of the public debate. They just couldn't avoid it. So where we are. As presidents of the charity, both Princes of Wales cultivated royal authority. They used institutional control and the personalization of their philanthropic efforts to cement this kind of authority. So here's the interesting question. What happens when this authority is challenged? In other words, why did Prince George anticipate the waters carrying his bill to be stormy? From which direction did he expect the wind to blow in his face? The founder of the Hospital Fund, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, is not generally known for his intellectual endeavors, but the prince had a keen interest in natural sciences. He cultivated the society of leading physicians and surgeons, and he read a lot about medical research. He hosted medical congresses. He promoted the foundation of the Lister Institute in 1891, and he became an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in 1897. So he had a keen interest in radium therapy, for example, and was interested in promoting research on the matter. For all we know, Prince Albert Edward approved personally that some of his charity money should be used to support medical research, should be given to research, and medical education. But in reality, he faced criticism trying to do so or speaking up for doing so. And the prince learned his lesson very quickly. So here's an example. In March 1900, Prince Albert Edward received a memorial published by the London Metropolitan Radical Federation. This Federation Council was composed of delegates from various working men's radical clubs in London. And these guys claimed in the memorial that they would represent about 40,000 to 50,000 workers in London. The Radical Federation in this pamphlet respectfully pointed out to the prince that they had a problem with how the charity money was used by many hospitals in London. The hospital's main purpose, the memorial said, was to help the poor, those who did not receive healthcare otherwise. And yet, they claimed, the hospitals would use the money given to them by the trust to support medical research. So, and here I had to stop as a person from the 21st century, and I was looking at the source from 1900, and I thought, I don't really see the issue, because medical research benefits the patients, doesn't it? But then sometimes you have to switch off the fact that you're a 21st century person, and you have to try and understand what is the argument for the contemporaries. So here's the argument from the point of view of the contemporaries. The understanding of the Radical Federation, medical research would not benefit poor patients. On the contrary, it would siphon off money, and this money would vanish into channels that would benefit the rich rather than the poor. Why is that? The question is, who becomes a doctor in the early 20th century? The Radical Federation claimed only rich people would become doctors. Only rich people would have the means to go to medical school, and these people don't need money. So the logic is, why should rich people be given the money for research when the same money can buy bandages for a poor patient? So the Radical Federation was challenging the institutional competence of the Hospital Fund. Are you aware where your money is going? Is the argument. it also challenges the social contract with society. If money goes to medical research, this is a waste of funds. And here another level comes in, because what does medical research mean around 1900? A lot of this was operating, for example, on living animals to support research. So here's another level of challenge coming in, because the radicals were also speaking in favor of the anti-vivisectionist movement. We see a poster here. The anti-vivisectionist movement became strong as a movement against animal cruelty from the 1880s. They targeted hospitals that performed operations on living animals for research purposes throughout the 1880s and 1890s. So suddenly, the hospital fund, and with it the Prince of Wales and all the hard work that had went into organizing the charity here, suddenly the hospital fund was at the center of a public debate around the uses of medical research and the limits. So there was a huge media discourse at the time, with societies campaigning in favor of medical research on animals as well. The argument was, do anti-vivisectionists actually care more about animals than about human beings? If you don't operate in animals, you might not be able to help human patients and the like. So just to say, I don't think this is the kind of publicity you really want to see for your charity. Plus, there's also quality here of a personal criticism against the charity's president, the Prince of Wales. The memorial that was written by the Radical Federation did not suggest that the Prince encouraged distributing funds away from the poor and towards medical research. Rather, there's a suggestion that the Prince might not have been aware, which is just as puzzling for the president of £1 million worth institution who's known to keep a tight leash on proceedings. Interestingly, the public debate here doesn't stop in 1900. Over the next decade, there's a continuous public discourse about the organization of the hospital fund, about its perceived lack of professionalism. Maybe it had grown out of hand, grown too big. Much of it was attributed to the prince's unchecked power and his very personal style of leadership. There's another argument in here, also brought forward by the Radical Federation. When so much money is given by the public to a charity, shouldn't then the public have a say in how the money is being used? Shouldn't there be some form of representation? In the words of the Radical Federation, and I quote, "The Council of the Metropolitan Radical Federation respectfully maintain that the people of London have a voice in this matter." So that's the challenge. The question is now, how does the monarchy respond? It responds with the Act of Incorporation from 1907. The Act of Incorporation 1907 was a private bill which would only benefit this particular institution here. It put, as Frank Prochaska has written, it put the hospital fund on a sound constitutional basis, so it provided a better organized framework. But it also, at the same time, confirmed royal prerogative in running this institution in perpetuity. And this is interesting. The private bill came about under a liberal government. It was initiated in December 1906. And then there was a committee looking into the matter and a discussion in the debate in the House of Commons on the 1st of July 1907. And then the bill got royal assent 3 weeks later. And according to the Act of Incorporation, in one clause in there, every president of this institution shall be a brother, a son, or a grandson of the sovereign. The appointment of the president should be made by the sovereign as well. So if you look at this, to me, it looks like there's a hereditary monarchy created within a hereditary monarchy in this institution. Like the personalization, a bond between this charity is created and the royal family. And this is exactly the stormy weather the Prince of Wales had mentioned in his letter of thanks. A general feeling in this debate was expressed that not one man should have such powers, that the people who give the money should have some sort of representation, say, in how the money is used. So I've got two quotes here for you. Feel welcome to have a look at them. The MPs I'm quoting here, Dr. Rutherford from Middlesex and Brentford, he is a Liberal MP, and the person, Mr. Jowett, who is asking, where do the people come in? Nothing short of some form of representation would satisfy the just demands of the people. He's a Labour MP. So it's not just Labour speaking out against this kind of legalization of the institution. And here now, finally, we learn why the Prince was so grateful to the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister, Liberal Prime Minister Henry Campbell Bannerman, spoke up in defense of the bill and supported the Royal Act of Incorporation by saying it must not be forgotten, although it seems sometimes to be forgotten, that this is really a fund created by the first president, the present king. It was he and his influence that obtained the money. It was to him that the money was given, money which would not have been obtained if it had not been given to him. And therefore, he and those connected with him are not the least unreasonable or going beyond their proper limits, desiring to have at least some say in the management of this large sum of money. So that's the Prime Minister's response. So I think there's a difference between having some say in the management of this large sum of money and having pretty much unchecked authority over how the money is used. But we get the sense here. So the main argument is the money was given to the royal family, so the royal family should be allowed to use it as the royal family sees fit. This is a personal matter. The second argument, the Prime Minister brings forward, and this is also very interesting. He also says the royal family came to us as a political institution to have a private bill created in support of their organization. They could have done this as a royal charter, yes, but they didn't. They decided to go through Parliament to share the institution and the discussion with the broader public. So we owe them, the Prime Minister said, to deal with this in their interest. The letter of thanks from the Prince of Wales came one day after this debate in the House of Commons, no wonder, because the Prime Minister had confirmed royal responsibility for the money, but also this sense of entitlement and bonding. As a researcher, I'm interested in this relationship and in the support provided to the monarchy by the Prime Minister. The good question to ask now is, why did Campbell Bannerman do this? Were he and Prince George very good friends? No, they weren't really. And we know that Campbell Bannerman and King Edward were not always on the best of terms either. So a little more research has to be done in maybe the personal relationship here that's at stake, or that's feeding into this story. But let's not forget there's a long tradition of British prime ministers who supported and strengthened royal authority, particularly in public debate. We can think back to Queen Victoria and Gladstone, for example. They didn't really, get on well, but Gladstone always had Queen Victoria's back in public debate. So maybe there's a pattern here. Points to take away from this case study. So I'm still very, very early stages with this case study and have way more questions than I have answers at the moment. But a few concluding thoughts on what all of this might actually tell us. First, let's think about the goal of the monarchy in early 20th century societies. The goal is to be seen as figureheads representing the nation, as caring for their subjects, which creates social capital and confirms them in their position. philanthropy provided a perfect framework for this. But engagement with charity came with a price tag attached for these royal princes. Because second, the social question was so complex at the time already that with the best of intentions, royal princes could find it impossible to represent all of their subjects, which is their job. Because charity is not just about helping the poor and inspiring others to do this. This is what they realized, I think. Money had to be given in the right way, through the right channels, to the right groups of society, to be acceptable. The third point is visibility, because the process of giving had become very public, with with donations being printed, numbers of donations being printed in newspaper, and with public pamphlets like the one we saw from the Radical Federation. But being in the spotlight as president of a charity like this meant being exposed to criticism as well. I also already learned from this case study that there are limits to how modern you can show yourself as a royal prince. That's an interesting one, because normally royal families, many royal families in the early 20th century try to be seen as supporting progress. They try to be seen as modern, embracing modernity. But when it comes to, say, funding medical research, clearly the philanthropic framework wasn't suitable to support such ideas of progress. So they had to find other channels to communicate their interests in progress. Then also, finally, the engagement between the royal family and parliament and public opinions within British society, all of the chit-chat and all of the communications we've discussed here, all of this reveals expectations beyond how to run a charity. This is not just about philanthropic work. I think we can agree on this. I hope we agree on this. All parties here involved are negotiating social status, they are negotiating authority, and they are also negotiating emotions and attitudes towards political participation. So maybe finally, between the monarch or the Princess of Wales and the political sphere, I think both parts of this communication here are very much aware that monarchy is a hereditary business, as in hereditary and a business. Both parts acknowledged this and accepted this. Right. So I think I'll stop here now, and I'm very much looking forward to engaging with your questions, any queries you might have. Thank you very much for listening.
I just want to say thank you very much to Heidi for presenting. That was really, really interesting. And as she said, she's happy to answer any questions. So if you do have them, they can just be typed in the chat box, which is, like I said earlier, in the bottom right of your screen. So if you have any questions, if you just want to type them in there, and then I can read them out for you.
Oh, that's silence, stunned silence.
I know. I was thinking it's very unusual if we have no questions, but there's always a first.
It's fine. It's also quite late. I totally get it.
I can see. Oh, here we go. So Elizabeth has a question. Was healthcare the most acceptable avenue for charity at this time?
Thank you. That's a very good question. It was certainly one avenue for charity at the time. It's probably the most traditional one, because many monarchs cared, even in not constitutional settings, but also in absolutist settings, for building hospitals, for example. It is quite interesting to see, I think we have to differentiate here. It is interesting to see that different members of royal families care about different charity aspects. So there can be we can see a gender aspect here as well. So for example, many female members of royal families, and I see this across Europe now, many female members of royal families were, for example, supporting religious charities, whereas supporting healthcare and supporting hospitals was like both female and both male. So and maybe veterans and war-related charities could be seen as sometimes more pursued by male members of the royal family. So there is some sort of gender aspect here as well. But acceptable they were. I think the charities are diversifying in the 19th century as well, with more social issues coming up and being at the center of public discussion, of course, from the 19th century. Maybe there was more variety in the kind of charities we're looking at. I mean, look at what the royal family is supporting, the British royal family is supporting today. These are hundreds and hundreds of different charities, including charity for the arts and sciences, for example. That was a very broad answer. I hope that makes sense to you. Thank you for the question. I saw a few raised hands, Chloe, but Chloe, you muted?
I muted myself so that when I was typing to the people who'd raised their hands, there wasn't any typing sounds. So yes, we do have another question from Fiona. Which other European constitutional monarchies are you using as comparators and why?
Thanks, Fiona. Good question. I'm working for my book. I'm mainly working with the British monarchy, French monarchies, and German monarchies in comparison. I chose this. Thank you for coming along, Joan. I chose these because they provide different layers of constitutionalism at different times. So we've got very established constitutional systems like Britain, very stable in many respects, in some respects. And we've got, for example, with France, a country, a nation state that constantly reinvents the idea of constitutionalism, and this constantly changes. So we've got 3 different dynasties using 3 different versions of constitutionalism. And that makes, for me, the point very interesting to look at these heirs. Is it different to be an heir in a new dynasty, or is it different from being an heir in an established constitutional system? So I look at the comparative factors here. It's also interesting for me to see who becomes an early constitutional system and a late constitutional system, because Prussia only becomes a constitutional state in 1850, which is when France is already leaving the constitutional status. So different factors why this is interesting on a comparative level.
And our next question is from June. Do you feel that any of the royals were involved in this aspect of charity as more of a way of promoting personal popularity than a charity aspect?
Wow. June, that's a great question. Thank you. I'm not really sure how to put this. I'm not sure you can really separate these 2 aspects. Do the royals I mentioned today, or maybe in general, do they care about the charity aspect? I think yes, definitely. Do they use their name and their popularity to support these charities? Yes. Do they profit from being seen in this particular role? Oh, yes. And not just in the 19th century or in 1907, but I think still today as well. It's part of, I think, the job description of a royal prince or princess to be engaging in philanthropy. And it has the added benefit that you become quite a visible person in public, and this is promoting, of course, your personal popularity. So I think these are really interlinked, and still today, not just back then in the times I was just looking at in my talk.
Thank you. And our next question is from Morna and Peter. Were royal supported charities mainly funded through public donation, or were some funded directly by royals?
Both. So both. For example, this hospital fund we just looked at, if you look at the annual reports are all available. The hospital, the trust, the modern version is an online archive, and you can actually look up all the annual reports. And the annual reports always list the sponsors. They list the people who give money. And every member of the royal family, the British royal family, was giving money to these charities, to their own charities, an annual sum, and a large sum. And by doing so, by showing we are giving because this is a worthy cause, and by doing so publicly, because this would be printed in the newspaper, they invited members of the respectable society to take part in this kind of exercise as well. So it's leading by example, really.
Thank you. Our next one is from Larissa, who's asked, would you mind talking a bit more about to what extent the royal family used the hospital fund to have a meaningful presence in the public sphere since they had no direct power anymore?
How long do you have, Larissa? No, absolutely not. I don't mind at all. So shall I talk a little bit about what it, so I didn't touch really upon what the princes actually did or where the money, how they supported the cause. So what I find really interesting is how the Princes of Wales, both of them, engaged, for example, the whole family, their whole families, to support this charity. For example, they had photographs taken of the royal children, and these royal photographs would then be sold, and the money from selling these photographs would be given to the charity. But this is not just raising money for the charity, it also means that people buy photographs of these royal children and take them home and keep them as tokens or put them up on a wall. So there's a deal made, as in, you know, the visibility of the royal family in public in exchange for the support of their charity. And this kind of connection royal families are building with their various audiences in constitutional settings, we think, as researchers, supported their general acceptance and confirmed their place in society, which wasn't natural for monarchies anymore, because the times had long gone by 1900 where royals could claim they had been invested by God in their position. That's just not an argument anymore. There's still a strong religious component of being a royal member of the royal family or a monarch, of course, still today. But around 1900, no monarch was able to say, I've been invested by God. The 19th century had shown that royal families could be dethroned, delegitimized, replaced by radical or republicans. So they had to get confirmation and legitimation from other sources. And the main source is that these are your subjects. So if you don't talk to your subjects, this can be tricky for your status in society. That's a very broad topic summed up in a few sentences. I hope this makes sense somehow. I'm very sorry.
She said thank you. So our next question is from Philippa, who says, do you know what happened to the animal research that you referred to? And was the concern of was this a concern of the radical group? If yes, by the Prince of Wales or of another person/group?
Philippa, I'm getting there. This is ongoing because I'm not a historian of science, really. I found myself a bit in a corner with this one. I don't really know much about anti-vivisectionism around 1900. I just found it super interesting that suddenly this comes out of the woodwork and becomes part of my topic. So I can promise you I'm working on it. The anti-vivisectionist movement is very interesting, but before I can come forward with an argument here, I'm afraid I have to do a little more digging in that particular corner. But it is interesting how the interests here are merging. Oh, great. Maybe you can tell me more about this. Philippa, you should
can put you guys in touch later. We can, once your research is completed, there could be a part 2 to this talk. So our next one is from Dan, who said, "Thank you, Heidi. This was very interesting. Did the hospital fund attempt to expand later outside of London? And do you think that industrial philanthropy in Manchester, etc., face the same kind of scrutiny from Labour, etc.?"
I'm pretty sure. Dan, great question. I think the charity, the hospital fund, was always very much London centered, because London had so much pains with the poor and looking after the poor and to do this. We mustn't forget this wasn't the only charity at the time. Of course, the hospital fund was in good company. There were many other amazingly successful charities at the time looking after healthcare and also poor healthcare, like the Sunday Fund, for example. And there's a constant feeling for the hospital fund, because it grows big so quickly, they always have to justify that they are not interfering with other charities and they're not basically taking money away from other charities. So that's the main concern. How can we position ourselves that society is still happy to give to us, but also to the Sunday Fund and also to other trusts? So how can we make this happen? So certainly the hospital fund didn't venture out too much. They wanted to create like a corner and a niche that was like quite London specific at the time. I haven't done research on philanthropy in Manchester or Liverpool, so sorry about this. It's a good point. I'm very much interested in looking up on this a bit further. Yeah, that's a good question.
And our next one is from Robert. The charity morphed into the King's Fund. Does it follow the original concepts now?
So there's a website. I'm happy to share the website. Let me just check. Sorry, I've got this in my, just bear with me for a sec. I've got this here. In case you're interested in looking this up. Here we go. Just copying this and sharing this in the chat for people in case. That's the King's Fund today. And they have a history section, by the way, so you can read up a little bit about this. In the question in terms of organization, I certainly think the original concept has broadened of the King's Fund. They do a lot more work. If you just look at the website for a moment, you will see just really from the first impressions, they are doing a lot more than supporting poor hospitals, that's for sure, or hospitals in total. So there's a whole huge program about healthcare and support of communities. That's really great. It has certainly grown. I think an interesting detail or an interesting information is that the Act of Incorporation, like the whole idea that the Prince of Wales has quite substantial powers here and that it's some sort of hereditary idea, this was in place until 2008. And in 2008, the Queen granted a royal charter. And since then, the King's Fund is under a royal charter. Until then, this whole organization was basically as it was designed in 1907, legally, organization-wise, which I find super interesting.
Yeah, I was just thinking in my head, wow. So the next one is from Ailey. Do you think that Albert Edwards' creation of the hospital fund was done at least partially in an effort to establish himself as a capable leader in the public sphere rather than just the heir apparent?
Yes. Yes. I think several things come together. I tried to mention this in my talk. He really had a keen interest in this whole affair. And he really knew, I mean, everybody who knows a little bit about Edward VII as a monarch, you will agree with me that he was probably the most, like, he was a super likable king, and he was really good at this. He was good at talking to people, convincing them to give money for a good cause. He knew all of London and all of Paris and so many people in society, and everybody was very happy to help and to support him. So he was basically a really good person to do this. And when Prince George took over, he was a very conscientious worker. He was really dedicated to the whole affair. So I think with both presidents, I mentioned today, the charity was really lucky. They did an amazing job here. But of course, it carved out a public profile for both princes that contributed to their royal persona. It created an own sphere of influence and an own sphere of of influence, I think, political influence, economic influence, that was absolutely vital for these princes. So yes, agreed.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? That's just kind of gotten to the end of those in the chat, but obviously if you have another question, just feel free to pop it in there.
Exactly. Thank you for great questions, by the way. This is really interesting to me. So everybody who's asking a question now is actually helping me with my research in my case study. Because this
there could be a part 2, guys. That's what she's saying. once more research is done.
It's work in progress. It's work in progress.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking if it's kind of been a few minutes now without any questions, so I think if there's not any more, we'll kind of conclude the event. See, there's already interest. Elizabeth saying I'd love to hear more. So watch this space.
We'll keep you posted.
We'll see what we can do. And Larissa. So yeah, thank you so much to everyone for attending today. And as Heidi said, thanks very much for the great questions. And I think a special thanks to Heidi for a really wonderful presentation and fantastic answers to the questions that you guys have asked. So enjoy your evening if you're in our time zone. Enjoy your afternoon if you're elsewhere. I'll see you guys later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. I greatly appreciate it, and thank you for being with us and for your interest in the topic. Good night.